And Andrew says, hey, my friend, I need to cross this river on your ferry, and I've got about 5,000 troops and all these wagons and all these horses and all these men. Give me a deal. And George says, I'll try my best, Major Jackson. How about $75,000? And this is about, I'm guessing, 1813? $75,000. Do y'all know what the president made in 1813? That was James Madison. He made $25,000. And here this Indian guy in Western Colbert, was one in Colbert County at the time, but he's asking 3 times the president's salary. And just if you don't have a clue what $75,000 in 1813 is, I looked it up. Today, he'd say, how about $1,762,860 and we'll let y'all cross. Now I'm just going to stop right here and tell you, Suzanne asked me what, that was my entry to this discussion today. That's why this place right here we stand on is important, in my opinion. $75,000 in 1813, Andrew Jackson didn't want to cross that ferry no more. He came right here. That's my opinion. That's not in a book. In fact, you can't hardly find your Bluff, but we'll get to that in a minute. Now, just so you don't think I'm making this up, you can go to Colbert Ferry and read it for yourself. This is the picture at Colbert Ferry, and it says on this sign, George Colbert charged Andrew Jackson $75,000 to cross the river. I didn't make that up. Suzanne says some of the stuff I say I might make up. I didn't make that up. Now the question is, did he pay it? The question is, did George really mean it? The question is, did they cross and then say, send it to the government? We don't know. Now I do know in reading that when he heard $75,000, he found a bunch of boats and put a lot of his troops and wagons on boats and sent them on down the river and to get to the Mississippi and get to New Orleans a lot quicker than driving them and a lot cheaper without crossing the ferry, and he may have done that more than once. Not sure about the $75,000 or if it was paid. If it was, that's humongous amount back in 1813. Now that didn't make them mad at each other, because when Jackson got to South Mississippi, South Alabama, and northwest Florida, guess who was fighting along beside him? George Colbert. They got 350 Chickasaw warriors, sent them south. He went with them, and they fought right along Jackson's group against the Red Sticks. That's the creeks. Y'all know Horseshoe Bend. That's what we're talking about. Red Sticks is not derogatory toward the Indians, by the way. The red stick came from the fact that they had about a 2-foot long stick that was painted red with rocks or metal embedded in it, and they would use that as a weapon. And the creeks were bad folks. And Jackson had a pretty heavy battle on his hands, but they finally defeated the Creeks. By the way, fighting right alongside Andrew Jackson, the name that you'll hear again shortly, a guy by the name of John Coffey. John Coffey has something to do with Lauderdale County, by the way. And I'm almost finished with George Colbert. You just have to know that once his fighting days were over and he ended up back here at Colbert Ferry, he only ran the ferry to 1819. He may have turned it over to one of his sons, or he may have just decided to stop the ferry. I don't know. I just noted It's just noted that it ended in 1819. 1830s came along. Guess who's president? Andrew Jackson. Guess what Jackson decided to do from the White House? We need to relocate these Native Americans. There's a bunch of empty space out in the west. It's known as the Trail of Tears, and it came right through here. And there's a place here in Sheffield called, this is really confusing to people that don't know where they are. In Sheffield, you can find Tuscumbia Landing. And at Tuscumbia Landing, before the dams, the water was deep enough for boats, and they put thousands of Native Americans on boats right here at Tuscumbia Landing and sent them west to the Mississippi River and got them off at the Mississippi River and let them walk on over to Oklahoma. And George Cobber's a big wealthy planter. He owns bunches of land. He's a wealthy man. He owns slaves. He gave it all up and left with his tribe. He said, I'll go. I mean, that's huge in my mind. That is huge. And so he took the boat. He got the Mississippi River bank. He took off to Oklahoma with the rest of his tribe. Just as they got into Oklahoma, and of course it wasn't called Oklahoma at the time, but as they got into the vicinity of the Chickasaw designation, there was Choctaw designation, there was Chickasaw designation, there was Cherokee designation. Of course, you know the Cherokees, a bunch of them went to the hills and didn't leave. But as George Colbert got to almost Chickasaw territory, he passed away in 1839. And so he was 74, 75 years old when he passed away. I got a feeling Andrew Jackson probably didn't even make it to the funeral, if there was one. I don't know. But anyway, back to Jackson. Back to South. Indian troubles are over. He is sent to New Orleans. Why New Orleans? There's no Indians in New Orleans. 1813, 1814, he's sent to New Orleans after taking care of the Indian troubles down there. The British were down there. The British were trying to take over New Orleans. This is an outgrowth of the War of 1812. Now, I'm not going to go into detail in the War of 1812, but you just need to be aware that the War of 1812 was all about the British trying to hold on to something in the New World. You know, they lost a few colonies, you know, back in the day. Here it is, 35 years later. They want to hold on to their territories around the Great Lakes. They want to hold on to Canada. The Spanish kind of came in to help out because the Spanish wanted to hold on to something called Florida down there. And in fact, if you look hard, you'll find that the Spanish and the British were actually helping the Creeks at Horseshoe Bend. Not in a great number, but they were there supporting them. And so Jackson had to defeat all of them. And so he got to New Orleans in the fall, late fall, early winter, 1814. And by early January of 1815, Andrew Jackson's forces finally defeated the British. Jackson's troops didn't have very many losses. The British had quite a few losses, most of them by desertion, believe it or not. They just didn't want to fight anymore down there in that swampy land. And by the time the country found out the Battle of New Orleans was a great decisive victory for America, and this young general, by that time he had been made general, by this young general is making a name for himself and quite a bit of notoriety, and within about 15 years he found himself in the White House. And so he was elected in 1828. Oh, by the way, just so you know, Battle of New Orleans was fought and finished in 1815. The war ended on December 24th, Christmas Eve in 1814. They signed a treaty, the British did, with America. The Treaty of Ghent. Now, Ghent's not in Virginia. Ghent's not in Washington, D.C. Ghent's in Belgium. And so they couldn't pick up the phone and call Washington and say, oh, by the way, we've signed a treaty. And so they didn't know. So they sent Jackson to fight the British. He's fighting a battle that don't need to be fought. The war's already had treaties done signed. The war's over with. But they fought the battle anyway. He didn't know it. And so they signed a treaty on December the 24th. It wasn't until February the 16th that word reached these shores. Oh, that war ended back last year. It was over with. But by that time, Jackson is a big hero in the press, and he's probably on his way home and headed this direction, in my opinion, because I can just use your imagination. You know how troops on horseback send out scouts. Y'all go find us the most direct route north to Tennessee. And by the way, don't go down there toward that ferry. We don't want to go that direction. Don't go that way. And so they came up through here, riding the bluff. Riding the bluff. And they looked off and said, oh, that's a long way down there. But if you ride a little ways this direction and ride a little ways this direction, there's natural ravines that go right down to the water. And so word came back to Jackson, we found a way across the river. It's absolutely free. All you got to do is walk across the river. No ferry. Water this time of year, whatever time that was, not that deep. And so Jackson and John Coffey found themselves here. This was their camp on this bluff, right here. Now, I have no idea what this place looked like in 1815, 1816. You look at all these big giant trees, guess what? They probably weren't here. Look at all these big fine houses, guess what? They definitely weren't here. This was all probably farmland, or just abandoned land, if at all. It may not have been claimed by anybody in 1816. And when Jackson stood here, and I've read two different accounts, but I've read that Jackson said, because he already had designs, I'm going further than being a military guy, this would make a great place for a national capital, speaking to John Coffey. And then he said, this would really be a good place just for a town anyway. And so Jackson sent a petition to Washington and said, we have found a place. We think there needs to be a town. And within a year's time, York Bluff was platted on the map. By the way, John Coffey was a surveyor. Guess who surveyed it? John Coffey did. York Bluff. Now I know what you're thinking. Same thing I am. Where did York Bluff get its name? Well, I'm here to tell you, here's a bluff. Don't ask me about the York, I don't have a clue. Seriously, I don't know. If you know, Will Goss, do you know where York? Oh, I'm sorry. I'm trying to put one of my students on the spot. I'm serious, I don't know. If you know Richard Sheridan, the Sheffield historian, not me, him. I asked him face to face, where did York Bluff get his name? He said, Jimmy, I do not know. And then I asked my mentor, Miss Betty Dyer. If she don't know it, it's unknown. And I asked her, where did York Bluff get its name? I do not know. Now I will tell you, you'll be welcome to look at this shortly. this is how it was platted initially. This was actually a hand drawn of this right here. This has a date from the Huntsville land records of 1820. Both of these maps are actually hanging in the local history room downtown in the library. I just went down there last week and took my phone and made a picture of them. But this is what York Bluff was, and in my opinion, and this is just my opinion, I think this is just a section. This is not entirely all of York Bluff by no means. Because the government said, okay, 300 acres is York Bluff. And this is my glorified imagination again. It's from right about here to Standpipe over to around Hatch Boulevard, which wasn't there, by the way, in 1820. That, and down to the vicinity of where the railroad would be. It wasn't there yet. That 300 acres, that's York Bluff. About 200 acres on the other side of the Standpipe over toward Park Boulevard and that other ravine down to the river, John Coffey and Andrew Jackson bought. On the other side of Hatch for about 80 more acres, Andrew Jackson and John Coffey bought that. Once Andrew left here, went over here at the ravine, you know what it's called today? Jackson Hollow. Jackson Hollow. My first teaching assignment was at L.E. Wilson Middle School down at Jackson Park. Y'all think we got a few Jacksons around here? Jackson Highway. You know where that came from? The military road that crossed right down here at this ravine. It went across the river. And if I can show you, I don't know if you can see this. Again, you're welcome to come up here. On the map, I took a green marker and I highlighted the military road that comes up through that ravine, and it basically follows Atlanta or Columbia's avenues on across into Tuscumbia and across Colbert Mountain and went all the way to the Gulf. There was a military road constructed by the Army after the Battle of New Orleans. It ends up around Columbia, Tennessee. Today, basically, the Jackson Highway is Highway 43 south or north. That's what we call it. Now, that's not the exact route, but that's as close as we can get and designate it as a name. And so we had York Bluff on the map, 300 acres or so by Coffey. And Andrew got back to Tennessee. He ran into an acquaintance by the name of James Jackson. That's not a relation, that's an acquaintance. And Andrew sold his holdings here at York Bluff to James Jackson. And later on, there was a land sale held, and Jackson and Coffey both sold their property here at York Bluff, and they moved across the river. John Coffey went north of Florence, you know where Cloverdale Road is, you know where the Walmart, it was built on Cloverdale Road, right off of behind where Walmart is on Cloverdale Road, there was a plantation house built called Hickory Hills that John Coffey built back in the mid-1800s. Just to his west, his buddy James Jackson went out there, built a little old place that he called the Forks of Cypress. Now, every time I tell that story, it just makes me mad. Because I'm thinking, dang, y'all had York Bluff, how come y'all couldn't put a plantation here? But no, we got to go across the river and build them, you know. So, y'all know the story, the Forks of Cypress. I mean, it's not there anymore, but at one time it was. Over the years, York Bluff just sat here. It just sat here, undeveloped. Land bought and sold. The guy that built Suzanne's house, Mr. Samuel Johnson, owned 16 lots here in York Bluff. I've got a piece of paper here, got them highlighted. I know exactly what they were. And locate them yet, and I'll tell you about why later. But when Mr. Johnson passed away, there had to be a sheriff's sale, and his lots were sold over in Tuscumbia at the courthouse, I assume. And that happened over and over because there were lots being held and nothing being done. And oh, by the way, 1818, Florence showed up. 1820, Tuscumbia showed up. Your Bluff, farmland. Thank y'all for coming. Oh, well, no, I've got a little more to go. There was an event in the South, well, across the eastern U.S. called the Civil War. Came right through here, obviously. Civil War ended and the South was in terrible shape. There was just no getting around it. We were in terrible shape. Reconstruction was taking place. And there was discussion of new economic development, new to take place of what had been destroyed. You know what I'm talking about. Now, we'll have to tell you this because most people will just pass right through here when they hear this name. One of the most influential men responsible for the founding of Sheffield was a guy by the name of Major George P. Keyes. His house was right down here on Montgomery Avenue. In fact, it was the first brick house built on Montgomery Avenue. And in fact, if you want to know the true story, it's the first brick house built, but it was built around a log cabin. That's a whole other story, but it's down there on the corner of that 10th, I guess, in Montgomery. George Keyes was from Montgomery, and he was trained as a lawyer. He really wasn't inclined to be a lawyer, and he found himself called to be a writer, and he got into the newspaper business following the Civil War. When you hear major, you hear colonel, you hear captain, in the next 2 or 3 minutes, it's all related to Confederacy and the veterans. So George Keyes ends up in Florence, and he begins to hear rumors and stirring that there may be some development in and around Florence. And so George Keyes knew one of his fellow citizens of Montgomery by the name of Alfred Moses. He invited Alfred, you need to come up here and check this place out on the river. And so Alfred and his brother, who ran the Moses Brothers Financial Banking Institution, that's a big name in Montgomery, they came. And first off, they went north of Lauderdale County, and they were looking and possibly invested in the railroad venture over there. And then this Colonel Gordon, we're sitting on Gordon Park right now, Gordon Drive right out here. Colonel Gordon came up to Moses and said, we need to go across the river and check out some iron ore deposits south of the river. And so George Keyes heard that and said, yes, Captain Moses, you need to go across the river to the lovely side. That's where y'all are sitting, by the way. Y'all are on the lovely side of the river. Now, don't tell anybody from Florence that I said that. We're on the lovely side. That's George Keyes. When Captain Moses and his brother came over, talked to Gordon, he said, I'm definitely interested. Let's contact our friends. Let's contact those guys that got some money. And the money was hard to come by after the war, as you well know. Not long after, an organization by the name of Sheffield Land, Iron and Coal Company was instituted. Had its beginnings in Montgomery, but they had money that came in from Atlanta, from Savannah, from Memphis, from Charleston, from you name it, big towns and big investors. And they put together a capital of $500,000, which that was huge following the Civil War, and that grew to $1 million by the time Sheffield was about to be founded. With that capital, they bought 3,000 acres around here that was, for the most part, just pure farmland. and they decided this is time to sell and create the Sheffield, Alabama that we want to have. Sheffield from what? Oh, by the way, Sheffield, England. Sheffield, England. Sheffield, England was a major steel center. That's what Sheffield, Alabama was destined to be. No disrespect to Florence and Tuscumbia, but the guys that founded Sheffield, Alabama said, we don't want to be a farm town. They're good folks. That's farm town. This is going to be a steel center. This is going to be an industrial center. This is going to be a progressive city. And so, at a big land sale in 1884, about this time of year actually, May, great time. You can just imagine all this vacant land, stakes out, you know, little flags where the land's been platted for sale. They sold 500 lots and brought in $350,000. So that replenished a big part of what they'd paid out. In the back of the wagon of the auctioneer that was riding around taking the bids, in the back of the wagon was a young lawyer by the name of Joseph Nathan. He went on to be a long-time resident of Sheffield, Judge Joe Nathan. He was known as Mr. Sheffield for his entire life because he had his finger in the pie of everything it was about Sheffield his entire life. He died in his house over here on River Bluff Drive. Excuse me, that's where I live. He wasn't at my house. He died on Park Boulevard at the age of 99. And so Judge Nathan was a very influential member of this society. February of 1885, Sheffield was constituted, incorporated. Captain Moses, the governor, said, Captain, you need to be the mayor. In my opinion, they could have let George Keyes be the mayor, but George was just a newspaper guy. Captain Moses was a veteran. He's a banker. He, knows all the right people. First city council, there was a guy by the name of Henry Habeler. The reason I mention him is because he owned much of this land. And he went down, you can walk down to his house right now. Go down on the corner right here and go down two houses. First house built on Montgomery Avenue was Henry Habeler. Well, he had to buy the property back they'd already sold. He had to go to Sheffield Landowner and Coal and say, oh, I like this piece of property. They said, well, it's going to be. So he had to pay for his own piece of property he just sold a few weeks before. Habeler was on that council, as was Morris Nathan, Judge Nathan's dad. He was the first postmaster, by the way. Abraham Moses, who was Captain Moses' brother, was on the first council. And there was a guy named Phil Campbell on that first council, by the way. Phil Campbell. Y'all thought that was a town, didn't you know? That was a guy. Phil Campbell was a railroad man here in Sheffield, and he was the one destined to bring the railroad across the river and south into the coal and iron ore fields. And what that would be, South Franklin at the time, Marion, Winston, Walker counties, that's where the railroad was heading. It was just going through Franklin County, by the way, one of the guys went out to meet the crew and said, Mr. Campbell, I want to make you a deal. If you'll bring this railroad through my property here, I'm trying to put together a trading post in a town. If you'll put us a depot right here on this rail spur, I'll name a town for you. So Phil Campbell did, and I don't know who the landowner was, but he named the town Phil Campbell. And there you go. It was named after a man that was on the first city council, and later on, Phil Campbell was a mayor here in Sheffield. And so a steel center. And by the way, it was a steel center. They produced. There were 5 steel mills here at one time. From 1890 to 1925 or 26, there were steel mills here. My wife's dad from Iuka said when he was a little boy, he could look look over from Iuka and look towards the shoals. He calls it Tri-Cities, by the way. And you could see the sky just being red. And that was the steel mills. But there was early on, and I'm just about done, there was early on a terrible financial panic that was very distressing to a young new town. Sheffield was founded in 1885, and in 1890 there was a nationwide almost depression. Some people call it depression. Some folks say it was a panic, but money was tight. There's a house down here on Montgomery Avenue that I do the tour. Mr. Sam Keller was a banker here in Sheffield in one of the very first banks. People were running on the bank, and he was wanting to make sure that his bank did not fail, and he said, I've got a brand new house. It sits right across the street from First Methodist Church. Go down there and look at the sign. He put his house up as collateral for his bank. The bank failed, and Mr. Keller lost his house that was about 3 years old. And you know what happens when you forfeit your house? Foreclosure is its name, and they held a sale on the steps of the courthouse, and some family out of Georgia bought that house for $2,000 in 1890 and just happened to go ahead and live there for the next 100 years. That's why the sign says Keller Bishop House. It was a bishop house, the family that bought the house and lived there for a long, long time. And so Sheffield was going to be different from Florence and Tuscumbia. And it had steel mills until the 20s. You know what saved the city? Now I know y'all cuss them a lot when they cross the streets and you can't get through. And the doggone railroad got the street blocked. Trains just sitting there. Well, guess what? If it hadn't been for the railroad, there wouldn't be no Sheffield. We'd be a ghost town. Southern Railroad picked Sheffield as its center of operations, just as the panic was about to hit America. I mean, within months before the panic, Southern Railway said, we're going to put our yards in Sheffield, the shops where they worked on the locomotives and where they worked on all the rail cars and built stuff and repaired stuff and brought 500 employees that equates to bunches of kids and bunches of families. And that's what saved Sheffield. Southern Railway came to Sheffield and it didn't fold. And so it was saved. Now I know depression took place in the 30s. It was difficult. I know that. But in the 40s and the 50s, this place was booming. 50s and 60s, this place was booming. I grew up here in the 60s. I remember you need to stop and think about this. 60s and 70s, my dad worked at Hester Chevrolet right down on the corner of 6th Street and Montgomery Avenue. In fact, I worked there while I was in college. At that point in time, you could have your pick of new cars bought at new car dealers in Sheffield. I mean, take your pick. There's probably, I'm guessing, 6, 8 different brands of new cars for sale in Sheffield, Alabama at the time. 70s, 80s, you know the story. Industries left, shopping habits left, changed, malls came. 80s and 90s, 2000, I mean, I know what Sheffield was like. You could lay down in the middle of Montgomery Avenue and take a nap. Thankfully, we've got a change in investors in Sheffield, change in interest in Sheffield. It's on the up and up, we hope. But now you know where it came from. This is where Andrew Jackson decided this needed to be a town. All because he didn't want to go across that ferry down there. Got a few things you can look at if you desire. But I do appreciate you coming. Thank you very much.